Okay, so we've now painted our model black all over in its night fighter colours, and it's really looking awesome now. So the next stage, before we do anything more and add anything more to the model, is to put the decals on. And the reason we're going to do that now rather than towards the end is it's easier to access the surfaces of the aeroplane before we put delicate parts on that will make it a bit more difficult and we might risk breaking off. So the next thing we're going to do is create a little stand to help the plane stay in one position while we add the decals. So to do that, we're going to modify the box that it came in. So we're going to take the lid off. And we're just going to sit the plane on the back end like that. Then what I want you to do is get a pencil and mark on the top of the box there where the wings are and where the tail is. Now we can take the model away. What we're going to do is we're just going to put down where we've made our pencil marks. And then we're going to fold these bits in like that. Then we can put our model back on top, and that is going to keep the model flat whilst we put the decals on. So we can use two hands, and we're keeping that off the ground and keeping it safe while we add the decals. So let's get that done next. So we've got, with this model, we've got two different sets of instructions for the decals. We've got this separate sheet which deals with the positioning of the smaller ones, and we've got the paint instructions which deals with the positioning of the larger ones. Now the smaller ones are very fiddly, and you can absolutely get away with just putting these larger ones on, which will show the model off really nicely. If you enjoy putting the decals on, then you can do these smaller ones which are much more fiddly. So I'm going to carry on and finish this. You can see I am putting the small ones on. So put all the decals on, the wings, the tail and the sides. I don't think there's many that go underneath. I think there's maybe just one tiny one. And then when you've put all the decals on, we're then ready to build the undercarriage. So I'll crack on and let you catch up with me. What we're going to do now is work on the undercarriage. So what I want you to do is turn your model over, put the wings in the two slots that you've made, and leave the tail to rest on the bottom. So we've now got a nice working jig. We can get to these and we're hands free. So the first thing we're going to do is we've already painted the parts and given them a wash. So we painted them, and that wash has just brought the detail out a little bit. So now we just need to make sure we've got the right parts and that we're orientating ourselves properly. So this bit here, where the wheel will go, needs to be sticking out towards the end of the wing. And we're just going to dry fit that and see how good a fit that is. Yeah, that fits in very nicely. So we're going to put that part in first. So let's get some glue. Now we've dry fitted, we're okay. I'm going to put a little bit of glue, and I always glue away from the actual model. So if something goes wrong and the glue suddenly spurts out or something, I'm not actually getting it on my model. And then let's just put that in. Okay, then the next part is this long strut. So again, I just need to check that I've got the right one. It is a bit fiddly, and I'm using tweezers partly so that you can see what I'm doing. So that goes in there and there. So yeah, I do have the right one. So just so that I can show you, there is a little hole there, and that long thin bit goes in there like that, and then that bit sits in the little slot. So let's put some glue on that. There we go. That's in the slot. Just make sure it's nice and straight. Brilliant. Okay, so I'll do the other side, and then we can move on to step 22, which is adding the wheels. So we're now at stage 22, which is asking us to add the wheels. So we need to paint them first, but I just wanted to take you through the next steps as well. So when we paint the wheels, the centers are 56, and then the tires are 33, which is the same black that we've used for the rest of the aeroplane. Now you can do that. I prefer to use a different shade of black so that they look different, but it's not a problem at all to use the same paint that you've got, and that saves you a little bit of time and money. But if you look at step 24, we're then adding these parts here, which are fairly big parts really, and those little parts on both sides, and they're also painted in the black for the night fighter. So we can do all of that painting at the same time. So let's start by removing the tires. So you'll see on the tire there's a flat part there, and that's the bit that is going to sit on the floor. And if you look on the back, they're shaped so that you can't put them onto our landing gear incorrectly. So what we want to do is to cut the tire off where it's rounded, which is the top of the tire, and leave the flat bit on the sprue for painting. So for ease, I'm going to use my cutters, but you use your knife or whatever you have. And we're going to cut them off and leave them on the sprue. I call this my sprue trick, and I've used it for many years. So we can now clean that up and paint the centres and the tyres and not have to worry about the bottoms, because that bit will be face down and no one's going to see it. So that just makes it easier for us to paint. Now on these parts here, all of that will need to be painted, because the bit that gets glue on isn't attached to the sprue. So we'll have to cut those off properly. Paint one side, stick them on some blue, cut them off, stick them on some blue tack, and then paint them on one side, let that paint dry, flip them over, put them on the blue tack again, paint them, let that paint dry before we can install them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these parts off, and these little parts here, and it looks like we can, yeah, let's do that just to show you. we can leave these parts on the sprue as well. So if I just cut that off, get rid of that. So I think looking at it, this part here, that very, very tiny location pin there, faces down. So we can paint these on the sprue. So if we clean that up, sand it. So if you trim it with your knife and sand it down like I've shown you, you can paint both sides of that at the same time. And when you've cleaned these parts up, if you perhaps paint this first, by the time you've painted the other parts, so if you paint that first, then paint that, then paint your tyres, and then by the time that's all dried, you'll be able to turn that over and paint that. So I'm going to paint those, and then we'll paint the centres together. So I've now painted all the parts that we discussed, the wheels and the various parts that go onto the undercarriage. So I'm going to start by putting the wheels on, which is the steps 22 and 23. So we're just going to put a little small blob of glue inside the wheel there. And before you do this, just check, I've already done one, but just check which one this should be, because when it goes on, you want to have the flat of the tyre facing slightly backwards, if that makes sense. So because the aeroplane is going to sit like that, so the flat needs to be not straight down but slightly backwards. So yeah, so that part goes on. Then this part here, there's a little square there which attaches to the little square there above the wheel, and then these two lugs underneath just tuck in there, like so. So this big peg here goes in front of, it goes behind this wheel strut here, so in front of that one, behind that one. So let's do that. So I'm just going to put a little bit of glue along that edge and in that square. Like so. Make sure it's all sat properly and square, and then you know it's in the correct position. And once they're dry, if there's any glue showing, you can always go in with a little paintbrush, put a dab of paint on it to cover it up and just touch up anything. And then this last piece here goes there, so let's put a little bit of glue on the underside of that. And that just drops in. Like so. Okay, so I'll do the other side, and then that's the undercarriage landing gear done. So now we've completed the undercarriage, we can put that to one side and let the glue dry and make sure that everything's good and solid before we come back to the aeroplane. So our next stage is to build the gun turret, and the first thing we need to do is decide whether we're going to put the pilot in or not. Well, we've already painted the pilot earlier on, So we're going to use the pilot. So that means if we're putting the pilot in, this part A20 doesn't need to be used. So this gets painted black, and then in the next step here, the guns, those parts get painted black too. And then in the next step, 28, A10 and A9, those parts get painted black, which makes up this assembly here, which is then attached onto the turret. So all of this is black with the exception of the gun barrels, which are gunmetal. So we can paint all these parts whilst we're assembling. So my thought process here is it's probably easier to build the parts, then paint the two assemblies, and put the guns in place after we've put the pilot in. And then we're going to do our first piece of glass work. So we're gonna get these parts off the sprue and clean them up, and then we can do some painting. So let's start with the gun turret base. I'm just going to remove it from the sprue. Yeah. Trim that a bit closer. Then we're going to get an abrasive stick and just sand that back. Without deforming the part. I'm going to use a slightly smaller grit just to finish that off. There we go. So there's a seam just inside here. So I'm just going to scrape that away. We've got a nice continuous part with no break. That will be very visible if you're not putting the pilot in. Slightly visible if you are. Okay, so that's the base done. And then we've got these gun parts. So these bits here are quite tricky. So as we don't risk breaking them, we're going to cut the ends of the gun barrels first and put our finger on just to stabilise it. There we go. Cutting away as always, because we'll trim it back up when we've cut it off. So that's the two gun parts, and then these two parts here, 9 and 10, we also need. So cut those off as well. Excuse me, my cough is getting better. Okay, I'll just trim that down. Get those bits out of the way, and let's trim this up while we're at it. So we're squaring off the ends there. And then if we turn it around, go right up to the end of the gun barrel and square that off too. So that's those parts trimmed up, and then there's a little bracing part, C20, that goes in the middle. Which must be on the other sprue. There it is. Okay, we'll just trim the ends of that as well. So this has been quite cleverly designed so that the guns are absolutely perfectly aligned. So that goes in there. There's a little bit of play in there, but not much. But that will make sure that the guns are all pointing in a nice straight, even line. So let's have a look at this part first. There's a very minor seam on there. So we're just going to move that off. So I'm going to guess there's another one on the other side. Bit tricky to see, but it's there. So that's that part cleaned up. Let's have a look at the gun barrels. Yeah, so there's seams on the gun barrels as well. Don't forget to do the insides of the barrels. Don't press too hard. These parts are very delicate. And we'll just sand the edges, the ends, make sure they're nice and flat. And that we've removed the gates properly. And then hold as close as you can between two fingers and just smooth off those ends as well. So that's that part done. Okay. It's quite a heavy seam underneath there, so I'm using my abrasive rather than the edge of my knife. That bit ultimately will have glue on it, so won't be seen. And we'll clean that up when it's glued together anyway. That part doesn't have the same issue, so that's all good. So I'm just going to dry fit these two parts so I understand how they go together. Okay, yeah, see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit of glue, put that in this hole here that we already cleaned this part up. And put this brace in. And whilst that's drying, make sure it's nice and straight. Look at it from all different angles, make sure it's straight in every angle. While that's drying, that glue there, we can clean this part up. Okay. And just clean the back up. And do the same on that end there. Okay. So it says in the instructions, I'll show you, that little black square means don't glue, which means you should be able to then move the guns. So We put a little blob of glue in there. And attach that. And then what I'd suggest is put it down. The gun's facing up. Just make sure you've pushed it together properly and that all 4 of those square ends are flat. Then you know everything's nice and straight. So we're going to leave that to dry before we apply some paint. So as the guns don't get glued, I think we're going to paint these parts first. So what I'm doing is I'm just dry fitting it, and then I'm going to pretend I've glued it and just clean up any seams that I can see now, so that when I come to glue it together I don't have to worry too much about any cleanup. Now this part's going to have a visible gap, and when we do a skill level 2 I'll show you how to fill that, but we're not going to bother at skill level 1. We're just going to make the parts. There we go. So I'm happy with that. So let's mount that on some blue tack and then we can get the parts painted up. So remembering that the outside surface is the bit that we want to paint. So the glued surface can sit on the blue tack. Now on this one, it's a little trickier, but because we need to paint the edges. So the only part that's not going to get seen is potentially this back area here and the bottom of that. So I'm going to push that bit into the blue tack there and see if that allows me to get the paintbrush in all the way around. Yeah, think that's going to work. So remembering that I'm going to put a pilot in there anyway. So yeah, we're now ready for painting. So I'm going to paint these parts up, let that glue dry, and then when we're ready to assemble I'll come back to you. So whilst the paint is drying on the components for the gun turret and we've got the black paint out, I'm going to paint the glass on the gun turret. So I've just removed it from the sprue, and we're going to very carefully clean it up because any scratches are going to get easily seen on the glass. So no different to how we do it, although what you'll find is that the plastic that they make the clear parts out of is a bit more brittle. It's harder and a bit more brittle than the rest of the plastic in the kit. Okay, now if this is your first model and you're not feeling confident enough, by all means skip painting it. There's nothing says you have to paint it, and at the end of the day it's your model. But if you fancy having a go, I'm going to show you how to do that. Now there's 2 steps to this. The first step is to paint it, and we're probably going to want to put 3 coats on it, and then the second step is to remove the paint off the glass. So don't worry if it's not dead straight. So I'm just going to show you here with one of the little raised lines that comes down. So all we're doing is following the top of the line. Yeah. And you can see I've gone over the edges and I'm not too worried about it. And then at the bottom there's quite a big ring there, and you can see we're going to have to put at least 3 coats on this. So then we've got another line that comes down here. Now, do your best to only paint the part that's supposed to be painted, but just do not panic if you go over, because I'm going to show you how to clean that up afterwards. So I'm going to just put this on a little bit of blue tack now, so that I can paint all the way around without touching it. So I'm going to paint it all the way around, and I'm going to give it the 3 coats or 4 coats that it might end up needing. And then when it's painted, I'll come back to you and show you how to clean it up. Okay, so we're now ready to start assembling the gun turret. So following the suggestion from the instructions, we now need to put the pilot in. And what we do is we thread him in from underneath, and it's a bit tight and a bit tricky, but there you go, he's in. And he can just sit there, don't necessarily need to put any glue on there. You could, if you wanted to, put a little bit of glue underneath, but once he's in place, he's going to sit there quite happily. So just put a bit of blue tack, and we're going to just mount it on the blue tack so that I've got my hands free again. So we now have to assemble the gun unit. And we've already test fitted this, but we're going to test fit it again, this time with the guns in place. And you'll notice I've not painted the barrels yet. We'll do that afterwards. So that sits in there like that. And then that sits on top. There we go, and then the guns should move. It actually looks quite tight, so and we can see that there's a bit there that I've not painted that I should have done, so we're going to have to touch that up. Just get my tweezers so you can see this a bit easier. So it does move, but it's quite tight, and there's a risk that we might get a little bit of glue on there. So what I'm going to suggest is that you put the guns in the position that you want them in the first instance. Now this ridge here is the front, and the controls are on the back. So you want to aim the guns forward that way whilst the glue's drying, and then it's in a position that you want them to be in. Okay. Now we also have to bear in mind that the guns are orientated to stick out of the turret. So that should be okay. So let's assemble that with a little bit of glue. So I'm just going to take that bit off. And what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to glue these bits here, because inevitably the glue will get on these bits and then the guns will be glued in place. But in case that happens, let's pose the guns the way you want them, in the position you want them first. So I'm going to start, just to make life a little easier for me, I'm going to just mount that on a bit of blue tack. Then we're carefully going to put a little bit of glue on there like so. Not too much, because when you sandwich it together it'll spread, and we don't want it spreading into where the guns are. Then we're going to place the guns carefully in place, and then if you've got tweezers, it's a lot easier. Put that in place. And I'm going to... There we go. Well, whilst that glue's drying, I'm going to move the guns. So I need to take it off the blue tack now. There we go. So we're going to let that dry, and then we need to touch up these bits here and a bit of mist underneath, and we need to paint the gun barrels in the gunmetal paint colour. So we'll put that to one side and give that a bit of a touch up in a minute before we glue it in front of the gunner. Okay. So whilst the glue's drying on that, and before I do some touch-up paint, now I want to show you the gun turret. So you can see the gun turret's been painted. I've actually got away with two coats, much to my surprise. Excuse me. But you will notice I've not been able to keep to the lines particularly well. And that's partly because the clear parts, they're really difficult to see where the lines are. Until you actually get a bit of paint on there. So I'm going to show you the technique for cleaning this up now. So what you're going to need is a cocktail stick. Okay, and then we're going to take an abrasive stick and we're just going to sand on one side and then turn it slightly and sand that side, so we've got a sharper point than we did have. Okay, so now we've got a nice pointy cocktail stick. Now the wood of the cocktail stick is softer than the plastic, so you're not going to do any damage. But the wood of the cocktail stick is also harder than the paint. Now we didn't prime this part. We didn't prime the part for a reason, and that is if you prime them, it's much more difficult to scratch the paint off. Now I know we've not primed this model at all, but just a general comment. So what we do is we take the cocktail stick and just drag it along the line. Now you can feel the line with the cocktail stick, whereas you couldn't when you were painting it with the brush. There we go, and that just gets rid of any paint that's not where you want it to be, i.e. it's on the glass part, the perspex part on the real plate, and not on the metal frame that would be painted. And what suddenly happens as you do that, and you don't need to press on very hard, just press on as hard as you need, you're straightening up your edges, and it suddenly looks totally different, $1 million better. Now it is a slow process, but it is somewhat therapeutic. So let me just do the other side of this, then you can see what a difference that's made. You can see how much smarter that looks now. So this bit here was really difficult because the line between what would be the metal and the perspex isn't very pronounced. It's not very raised, which is part of the issue of the process of moulding it. They've done the best they can, but I can now go in with a cocktail stick and gently remove that paint, because I can feel, even though the edge is really subtle, I can feel it with my cocktail stick. And it's naturally, because you're pressing on the glass, naturally not going to go onto the raised areas, which are the bits that you want painted. There we go. So I'll carry on and finish that and show you what that looks like when it's done, and then we can finish the assembly of the gun turret. So we now have all the parts of the gun turret painted up. So we have the guns painted black and gunmetal, and we have the turret top now painted in the black, and we've used the cocktail stick to smarten it up, and that all looks good. And we have the turret base with the piloting. So next thing I'm going to do before we actually fit the guns is just scrape away any paint underneath that might be causing an obstruction, and get in the way of the glue, particularly around this locating lug here. And because I have just test fitted this before the video, I know it's a little bit tight. It's not the easiest thing to clean because it's not just it's small, but the guns, you can probably see, keep moving on me. Okay, so let's just test fit that again. Yeah, that's going to work this time. It is a tricky part to put in though. So we're going to put a little bit of glue inside the locating lug there. And that's the only place I'm going to put it. It's quite a tight fit. It's not going to move once it's in place. Make sure you get your orientation right and that you've got that facing forward, that sort of long lump. Push it down. Yeah, it's very fiddly. Okay, that looks good. So normally with these glass parts, and we will see this when we come to fit more glass parts in later on, normally we stick these on using PVA glue, because the ordinary glue, the liquid cement that we've been using, if it gets on the glass, it makes wherever it's made contact go foggy and misty, and you'll get a spot on it, or worse, the whole thing will fog up, and we don't want that. So in this instance, because there's a lot of area that's painted, I'm going to put just 4 little blobs on, just to locate it in place, because I know the risk is low. But with other items where, you know, the you've only got something as thick as one of those lines, you're absolutely going to use PVA, and we'll use PVA for the cockpit. So this is a little tricky again. So we've got to thread the guns through the window and get that over the top. There we go. That actually looks really good with the pilot in place. Yeah, and gun turrets can be quite tricky. And when we come to do a Lancaster bomber, we'll have a couple of turrets that we'll need to do. So a little bit of glue there. A little bit of glue there. A little bit of glue there, and that should do it. Make sure it's sitting down properly all around. And that's the gun turret complete. So what we can do now is that gun turret just pops into there like so. Bit tricky with the pilot's legs. I'm going to wait till the glue dries, but once your glue's dried, place your turret in place, and then the next thing we're going to look at, because that gets us to the end of step 30. Next thing we're going to look at is painting the propeller, and we're going to also paint the exhaust system, and then we've got some little parts there to visit. So the antennae, the pitot tube, so some small bits that we need to place. And in the case of the aerials, we're going to have to do a little bit of adjusting of the length, as you can see there, because the full length is in flight and they're shortened when it's landed. They pull in, which is really clever and ingenious. And then we've got the cockpit canopy to do paint and stick on, and then we're done. So we're nearly there, guys. Okay, great. So let's have a look at the prop. So we're now ready to look at the propeller. And having looked at the instructions, so there's 3 parts to assemble, and then these 2 parts assemble to make the spinner, and this pin goes through that part without being glued in and glues into there, which should allow the prop to rotate when that bit is glued inside the front of the fuselage like that. So that's the theory. I quite often find these things don't work, and we end up with a propeller glued in place. But how many times do you actually flip the propeller around? In my experience, not very often. So we're going to start by painting, by gluing these 2 parts together and then painting the prop. Now, when we look at the painting instructions for this, it's not surprisingly black, but the very tip is yellow. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to paint the whole of the prop yellow to start with, and then we'll paint black down it second. And the reason we do that is if we paint it all black, it's much harder to paint the yellow on top. It'll take more coats, and then that will be thick. The end will be thicker than the rest of the propeller, and it'll look silly. So that's why we do it the way we do it. Always paint the lightest colour first is generally my rule of thumb, and it's done me well. So going to just take these parts off. And we're going to glue these two together because when the nose cone goes over it, we won't see this front facing plate. So it really doesn't matter if we get a little bit of paint on it, and it gives me a bigger area to stick on the blue tack, which will help keep it steady while we glue the part. Okay, there we go. And then these are quite tricky to get off because you want to lie them flat. Let me show you. You want to lie them flat, but they're actually then off the cutting mat. It is doable, just with a little bit of care. You can see the difference though, using a knife and using the sprue cutters. You can get a lot closer with the sprue cutters, and then you're going to flip it over and trim it back again with the knife. And then we're going to just sand that into shape. Now this is good because usually part of the propeller is connected and the cleanup is a lot harder. I'm just looking if there's any seams, and there isn't much in the way of seams, to be honest. Oh, looks good. Let me just carry on. Right, I'm going to finish cleaning this up because it's going to take a minute, and then we'll glue these two parts together as per the instructions, like so. I'll mount it on some blue tack, and then we're ready to paint. So we've glued the propeller together and mounted it on some blue tack. So we're now ready to paint it. So what we want to do is use as few brush strokes as possible so that we use as few coats of paint as possible. So we should be able to do a single sweep the full length, then we leave it, let it dry, and that way we should get away with 2, possibly 3. Yellow like white is one of the most difficult colours to paint. You can see how opaque it is. So we're just going to do that, and don't worry about how even it might be, because that'll improve with every coat. We do the same on the back, and don't worry about getting paint on the spinner, because that's all going to get hidden anyway. There we go. And don't worry if it ends up being a bit lumpy, if you've got blobs on it, because we can always sand it back down. Okay, so I've got a glob there, for example, and a glob there, and I'm just going to even those out. There we go. So we now can put that to one side, let that dry. We'll put the paint away and wash our brush. So whilst that's drying, that gives us an opportunity to look at some of these other parts. So this part here doesn't need painting because it gets hidden inside, so that part can be cut off and cleaned up, put in your box. These two parts, the exhaust, you can clean them up, and what you can do is mount them in some blue tack like that, and they get painted gunmetal, so we can do that. And then we've got the rear wheel here, the tail wheel. So if we clean up the seams on that, we can paint the, I'm guessing it's aluminium colour, I need to check, but we can paint the metal bit first and the centre of the tyre first, and then with the smallest brush possible paint the tyre in the same colour as you've painted the front tyre, whether that's a black or a different black. I'll come back to the pit-up tube because it needs removing very, very carefully. And then the other thing we can do is clean up the spinner, and I'm just going to take the sprue off this and show you what we'll do with that. If you take the spinner and clean it up, you can then mount that in a bit of blue tack, and that can be painted as well. So these are all things we can do between letting the yellow paint dry and giving it another coat. So I suspect we might get away with just 2 coats of the yellow paint. You can see it's touch dry already, and then we're good to go. So you go and clean all your parts up. I'll do the same, and paint the exhausts gunmetal, and then we'll glue those on when you come back. So as you can see, we've now got a number of parts collected together that have been cleaned up and are ready for painting in black paint. Most of them I've already painted some parts in the gunmetal, the exhaust parts there, and I've already painted the tail wheel, but I want to give that a wash, which we'll do at the same time as the exhausts. So we need to paint the props black, the nose cone black. We've got the aerials. Now, the easiest way to paint the aerials is to just leave them on the sprue and paint the tip, because we're trimming them down. If you're doing yours with the wings up, with the wheels up in flying mode, and you want the full length, then cut it off, put it in some blue tack, paint one end of it, and then if needs be, once it's dry, you can paint the other end of it. That would be my suggestion. Now I just wanted to talk to you about this part A24, which is the pit-up tube. So here you can see it's very, very thin at the end, and it's going to break very easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a knife and we're just going to trim away from it, and then slowly trim towards it, and then finally give it a gentle sand. But it's a very delicate part, so we have to be careful. So let's just do that and see what that looks like. So as always, the flattest side down. Put my finger on it so it doesn't move too much. So I've cut that away quite successfully. Right, so we've now got that removed. And we're just going to trim it back a little bit at a time till we get as close as we dare. So if I just show you that. Yep, so there's just a little tab on there. And we're going to hold it against my finger so that we're not bending it. And gently sand it back. So I'm putting very little pressure on it at all. I'm just really dragging it along the top and letting the grip from the sanding stick wear it down. So that's going to take a little bit of time. I'll get back to you when it's done, but that is how we do it, and do the same at this end. So we're now ready to paint all these parts black. I'm not going to take you through that. You know what you're doing now. So everything that needs to be painted black, we'll paint the same black that we've used for the rest of the model. But I do want to show you how we're going to paint the propellers so that we get the yellow tips. So I'm using a small flat brush, and we start like that. Okay, and then on your second one, you want to try and achieve the same distance away. Now, when we come to do the next build, I will show you a different way of doing this, which gives you a nice straight line, but it's a slightly more advanced skill because we're using masking tape, and masking tape comes with its own set of things to think about. So we don't want the tip to be too big, so if you're not happy with it, just gently wiggle your brush up, because it's just the very tip. When you're happy that you've got them all the same length, you can then take that round and do it on the back. So what will be easier is if you paint the fronts and then take this off and flip it over and paint the back. So you might even want to get the paint to have dried a moment or two before you do the backs. So I'm going to carry on painting these, and I'll come back to you when everything's painted. So we're nearly finished now with this tremendous model. The gun turret has now been fitted, and we have painted the various parts black, and we've cleaned the glass up using a cocktail stick, as I've shown you. So now we've just got some final assembly bits and putting the canopy in place. So let's crack on with that. So we're now at, having completed this step here, we now need to add the exhaust manifold outlets. So let's do that. So I've already painted them, and we painted them the gunmetal that it said, and you'll notice that the two parts are configured differently, so you can't put them in on the incorrect side. So all we have to do is identify which side they go on. Let's do a test fit. There we go, that goes in nice and easy. So let's glue those in. So all we're going to do is put a little bit of glue on the two longer bits. And then as that pushes into the slot, that glue will get moved around to where it's needed. That's simple. Okay, so we'll just leave that for a second to dry, and then we can put the other one in, if I can find it. There it is. So we have to be a little bit more careful with this one, because we don't want the glue oozing out. Because the pegs are on each end, there's a risk it could ooze out. So make sure you get it in the right way round, so the narrow end points forward. Yeah, there we go. So that's that bit done, and that actually makes it look a bit more like a plane already, doesn't it? Right, so we've also got to put the propeller together. So that's now been painted, and we've painted the tip ends. So we have this part that's glued on the back, and then this goes in to the end. And the idea is, if I don't drop it, the idea is just that very end is glued in, and then this part gets glued into the aeroplane, and the prop should spin. My experience is sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, just because of glue getting in the way, but we will try and do it properly. Also, sometimes the propeller can hang a little bit loose and you just need to glue it into place properly anyway. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that for a second, just for the glue to cure before we put it into there, because otherwise it could get a little bit messy. So here's the tail wheel, and that's been painted aluminium. If you remember, it doesn't say what particular colour to paint it, but it would be aluminium, I'm guessing. And then the centre's aluminium, although that's gone quite dark with the black wash that I gave it afterwards. So I'm just going to remove that from the sprue. Obviously you use your hobby knife in the way I've shown. So it's quite a tiny part, and that's going to go in that hole there. Like so. So best way to do that, plop it in. So now you're going to have to be very careful of your jig, because this flap will get in the way. So what we're going to do, simply going to turn that around the other way, and there we go. That doesn't foul the wheel, but do check carefully. So that completes step 33. So these other parts here are simply placed in location holes in the same way as the rear wheel. So I'm going to crack on and do that, and then I'll come back to you to do the wing lights, the canopies, and gluing that in place, and then we're done. Okay, so we're now ready to put the cockpit canopy on. I just want to show you what I've done. So we have added the pitot tube there, and on hindsight it's probably the last item you want to put in, because the risk of breaking it off is quite high. We've just touched up the paint around the pilot seat area before we put the glass on, and making sure that that's all nice and right, because it needed a little bit of touch up. So that's important to do before you cover the canopy up. And then underneath we've put the aerial in at the bottom here. Now there's no length given in the instructions, it just says cut it, so as long as it's shorter than the tail wheel you're fine. And then I've put the front one in, and as you can see, I've misunderstood. I thought we were cutting both of them short, but this one stays full length, so I'll need to just give that a little touch of paint. Now then, that then takes us to adding the wing lights. So what I've done is I've cut them off the sprue and given them a little bit of a file on each side, and then I've pushed that one in place to dry fit it, and I can't get it out, so I'm leaving it there. And I've had the same happen with the propeller. So I've put the nose cone on, pushed it into place just to dry fit it, and the tolerances are so tight I can't get it off again, so it's just going to stay on. So what we're going to do, we're going to glue the propeller in place next job. Let me just get my glue. So to do that, we're going to put some glue on the inside area here. Rather than on the propeller, because we can get it on the plane if we put it on the propeller. And then this part just pushes in like so, and you shouldn't be able to see any of the bare plastic. Okay, so whether mine's going to spin or not, I don't know, but what I would say is get your propeller in the position you want it in whilst that glue's drying, so if it doesn't move, you've got it the way you want it. Okay, so I'm going to put that to one side for a sec and talk you through what we're going to do for this last stage of the build, which is adding the canopies. So we're going to need to use a different glue. So we're going to use PVA glue, and the reason why we use PVA is because it dries clear and it's strong enough just to hold the parts in place as we want. If we use ordinary glue like this that I've not put the top on and will do now, because this is a much stronger glue and it reacts with the plastic, it can make the clear part fog up and go misty, and we don't want that. So to keep that all looking smart, you've put all the effort into painting it and scratching clear the paint. We're going to use the PVA glue to keep it safe. So there's two options in the kit. There's the full, well, more than two, three options in the kit. There's the full canopy with the canopy closed over the pilot. And that comes with a drop down position and an up position. And again, I don't really know what those differences are. But when we did this part behind the gun turret, we did it up. So I'm going to guess if you've gone up, use the up one. Or there's open, and I've gone for the open so that we can see the pilot. So if we look at the instructions, if we're going for the open, there's a part that we put in first, and then this part fits over the top, and then we have the forward windshield, and it should look like that when finished. So let's get on with that. So what I've done is I've put the PVA glue into a milk bottle top or anything that's fine, and now I tend to use a piece of wire in an old drill handle, and I use this for my super glue, and it does perfectly well for that. However, you can do it quite easily with a cocktail stick, and I'll show you the cocktail stick method. So let's take the first part, which is this one here, and we're just going to remove it from the sprue that we left on so we could paint it. And then I'm just going to sand that nice and flat. Like so. And now we'll test fit it. So this thick bit at the back faces the gun turret. So just so I can understand it. Okay, so that's a nice tight fit. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of glue on this area here, which helps position the glass in the right place. And then I'm just going to put 3 tiny blobs, making sure we don't get it on the outside of the fuselage. And don't worry if you do. A little bit of damp kitchen roll will quickly take that off. It's quite slow drying, so we don't need to worry about it too much. You can see that I've bent that, so definitely put that on last. Okay, So we've now got that glue in place. We've not put too much on because we're only literally holding it in place, and to be honest, it's quite tight fitting anyway. So let's just push that down. There we go. So that should hold in place. And whilst that glue sets on that, we can then go to this bit of canopy, which goes over the top. And again, just gonna sand that down, and this will need a little bit of touch up. So we'll need to go around with a small brush and just replace the paint that I've removed, sanding it flat, but we knew that we were going to do that anyway. And I'm just noticed I've not tidied that up particularly well. Okay, so we've still got the glue on the edges that we put on, which will hold this in place as well. So let's put that on the top. Now don't worry if you can still see a little bit of the glue. I don't know if the camera's picking that up. It dries clear, so it won't be seen. It won't be seen. So that looks really nice. And then we're going to do this final bit, which is the windshield. Okay, so make sure we get the orientation right. So this thick bit of paint goes at the top. So she should go on like that. So what we're going to do in this instance, we're going to put a little bit of glue actually on the shield, because putting it on the aeroplane like we did with the first one is not as easy, because it's not quite as clear where the canopy sits. So just make sure it's nice and straight and looks right. Now I've done this wing light, like I said, and it's stuck in. When you put the wing light in, we're using exactly the same method, a little bit of PVA glue, and make sure that the slope is of the part is in line with the front edge of the wing there, because it has a thicker end and a thinner end, and if you try and put it in the wrong way round and you can't get it off, then it's going to look a bit daft. There we go. So this is actually a test fit, and if it's loose, we'll take it out and put some glue in, and if, as I suspect, it's going to be tight, we will just leave it there. There we go. And that pitot tube is getting in my way again. Right. And that is us done. Our last action now is to go around with a little bit of paint, touch up there, paint in the aerial underneath that we didn't do right. Just check that there's no little scratches. There's a tiny one there, and just paint those in. That is your first model complete. Now the Night Fighter was matte black, and it was totally matte so that moonlight wouldn't shine off it, and it was harder to find. So my paint's slightly shiny, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over it with a product, if I can find it, called Matte Coat. You can get it from the Airfix store where you buy your model, or various online retailers will have it. places like Hanance and E-Models and places like that. Now, if you've not got that, don't worry, you've made an excellent model and it absolutely looks beautiful. But if you want just that last finish, then you can get yourself some of that. You'll use it on lots of models and you just brush it over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a matte coat, let all these parts dry, and then I'll post up a picture of the completed model.
Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so. It's free, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can hit my PayPal link in the text below. Every pound goes straight into the channel to keep the cameras rolling and to do more fun stuff for you to watch.